Hi everybody, welcome to my super cool asynchronous presentation to the Practicum. I apologize for not being with you guys in person. My husband just went on a trimester schedule at his college and he starts a new schedule today. So lucky me, I had to run home and watch my beautiful children and make this video for you so that we could talk about some really important things that are coming up for you guys at this stage of English 1020. So you guys already talked a little bit with Adrienne about your questions, specifically about the infographic, but it sounds like some other stuff has come up as well. So this video is a chance for me to talk with you guys a little bit about reflection, as well as the infographic, and specifically sounds like we're going to be talking a little bit about grading in both of these areas. So first of all, let me just answer this first question that I have here. How do you grade reflection? Me? Should we even grade it? I think this is a really smart and important question for all teachers to ask themselves. I'm going to take those in reverse order, going from broad to more specifically to my own experience. Should we even grade reflection? My answer to almost anything, it turns out, is it depends. I mean, that's a really rhetorically handy phrase, right? But when you're thinking about should I even grade reflection, for me, the answer is it depends. What is the purpose for which you are assigning the reflection? I mean, that is a really pedagogically loaded question sometimes, but we assign reflection for lots of different purposes. And Kathleen Blake Yancey outlines that for us. She did a really seminal, systematic job. You guys have probably already talked about it. But, Yancey outlines for us these three types of reflection that she sees in the classroom: reflection in action, constructive reflection, and reflection in presentation. And each one of these she identifies as working out a different pedagogical purpose, a different learning use value, if you will. So of course, reflection in action, this is heavily process-based. I like to think about reflection in action like meditative reflection. If you've ever had instruction on the steps for meditation, I'm thinking back to times when I've been in yoga and I've been told what to do with your thoughts, right? You sit really still, you breathe, you try to empty your mind of thoughts, tune in to other things. But if you see a thought, right, you notice it passing by, you just pause and notice it, and then you let it go on its way. Reflection in action is essentially asking students to do this with their writing thoughts. They're in process. They're in the midst of a large, complex writing task, and we ask them to pause and notice what's going on. What are they thinking? We ask them to look back at things that have worked or not worked. We ask them to look forward to new plans, to new adjustments that they can make in the moment. The rubber meets the road here because we're just having them do this on the fly while they're working on a project. Constructive reflection is a little bit different because we're working on between drafts or between assignments. So this is where we're asking students to really kind of take a step back and connect what they've just done. They've completed a writing project or they've completed a draft, and now we want them to connect it to themselves metacognitively. We want them to make connections between their writing process and their learning process. So this kind of reflection is more connected to knowledge transfer. We're looking for near transfer between assignments. We're looking for students to be pausing, but in a different way. So it's not on the fly kind of reflection that they're going to actually have use value for in the midst of the project. It's thinking, what did I take from that project that I can take into the next project? And then, of course, reflection and presentation is rhetorical reflection. You're asking students to reflect on their learning, on their writing process for an audience. So there's lots of other categories of reflection. I believe Gorzelski et al. illuminated like almost 20 different types of metacognition. So you can check that article out and learn a lot more about metacognition and the types of thinking that our students can do around their writing. But even if we just took Yancey's 3 types of reflection, each one of them has a different purpose. And thus, as teachers, we would evaluate it differently. If I'm asking my students to reflect and process on the fly, I often don't really have a lot of time to give them feedback on how they're reflecting. I'm just checking to see that they're making the moves that I'm asking them to make. Why is that even important? I will argue that it is important to check your reflection and action just to make sure students are doing the thinking that you're asking them to do. I mean, you could give them full credit for it, but you could also see where you as an instructor need to give more direct instruction about the type of thinking that they need to do. Constructive reflection, this can be a little bit more intense in terms of feedback. If you're wanting to push particular students toward learning goals, you can use constructive reflection to assess how they are doing with those learning goals, and you can pose thoughtful questions. You can kind of push them toward the next step in their thinking and their learning. And again, this can be evaluated. You can give people full credit for that, just for playing along and doing that reflection, but it's the assessment part, the formative assessment, that helps students grow in their thinking. You could also attach that to, if you're doing a constructive reflection, say, between drafts, you can think about, hey, I want to have students definitely address A, B, and C. And so your evaluation or the points could be tied to whether or not they address those points. But it doesn't have to be. Again, what we want to do is we want to guide students through particular thinking processes. Now, the place I would argue where grading reflection is most important is when we ask students to do reflection in presentation. So this is reflection that we've specifically assigned to them for a particular rhetorical purpose. The big one that we assign in English 1020 is the final portfolio, where we ask them to make particular reflective arguments about their learning for a very wide audience, wider than the classroom, wider than the instructor. We're thinking about assessment committees, and it's important to us as a program to know what students are arguing about their own learning. That's a whole other conversation. We can talk about assessment some other time, but for reflection and presentation, oftentimes we have specific expectations around what that reflection should look like. And this is where we kind of are smushing the gray area between reflection and reflective writing. That's kind of a sticky wicket, right? Because isn't it reflection if I write it down just as much as if I think it in my head? Well, not for research purposes. I just got finished working with the Composition Research Committee on a couple of articles, and in one of them we had to take about a page to explain why reflective writing is different than mere reflection. And the main difference is that we can reflect in lots of ways. Silently, in our heads. We can reflect verbally. And we often have our students work in these multiple modalities to do reflection, right? In which case, evaluation becomes less important than the actual thinking and cognitive processes. When we ask students to create a piece of reflective writing, we're transitioning between the process and the product. And this is a transition we do a lot in writing classes. We have to transition between the process of brainstorming and the product of a shitty first draft. We have to transition students between the process of gathering research and the product of written research arguments. So when it comes to reflective writing, I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of a written genre, just like any other genre. Reflective writing has conventions. Those conventions show us the expectations and also help us to sort of categorize what makes good reflective writing. because we have those same kind of conventional expectations around what makes good research writing. We have those same kind of conventional expectations around what makes good rhetorical, analytical writing. So it's the same for reflective writing, not research writing. It's the same for all of them. So, okay, here's the deal. One of the findings that we saw in one of the studies that we just finished with the research committee was very interesting. We were dealing with reflection and presentation, portfolio reflection arguments, and we were looking at the assessment scores that were given to hundreds, and I mean hundreds. We read a lot of reflective essays. And we noticed something about the scores. We were trying to look at what makes good reflective writing in presentation. And we started to do some kind of genre analysis. We were doing discourse analysis. What are the features that we see in the high scoring reflective essays versus the lower scoring essays? So there were three main conventions of reflective writing and presentation that we noticed that were common across most of the reflective essays. Where all of them were present, the scores were the highest, and where there was one or two, the scores were much lower. So the three things that we identified were in reflective writing and presentation, if students can summarize, if they can make an application, and if they can provide specific evidence. Those three conventions, if you could do all three, if we saw all three of them working together, then those reflective pieces often had the higher scores. And if there was just one element, it was often the lowest scores. Okay, fine, you say. There's been some research on reflection, yada, yada, yada. What does this have to do with the infographic? I'm so glad you asked. This is really important when it comes to the reflective piece of the infographic for a couple of reasons. Okay, so I shared with you some of the results of that study, mainly to illustrate that reflective writing has conventions, and if it has conventions, we can evaluate it on those conventions. Another thing that we talked about was that it depends on the reflective purposes that you have for your students, how you might assess or evaluate the reflection. Great. So let's talk about the infographic now. What is the pedagogical use value of the reflection in the infographic project? A couple of things. So the reflection here is doing double duty in a sense, because on the one hand, it's the first explicit assignment of reflection in presentation that students have seen yet. They're about to start their final portfolio where there will be a much bigger reflection and presentation assignment, but this serves as like the softball pitch that helps them get warmed up. And so for that reason, it's important for us to give good feedback and evaluate it pretty fairly in the terms of reflection in presentation. Another reason that it's important to evaluate the reflective part of the infographic is because we're asking it to do a lot of heavy lifting in that assignment, right? So like, as you guys are already seeing, project 3A is huge. You can't even see my other hand. It's so big. Project 3B, we like have to squeeze it in, and it could take a lot longer if we really got cozy with it, but we can't. We don't have time. So a lot of the proof of concept and proof of learning that we're asking from students comes in their reflective essay, because we're looking to see if they're making the connections that we intend for them to make by even doing this visual project at all. So it's important to give them feedback on that reflection that will help them both pause and evaluate whether or not they are making the connections that we want them to make, and that will help them think forward to their final portfolio. So when I grade that reflection, in the infographic, I really try to stick to the rubric. I'm looking for particular elements to be there because I want them to be thinking about those elements. In fact, it's important to me. The assignment isn't successful for me unless students are doing that thinking. I mean, you can make a visual, whatever. What's the point of having them make a visual? What's the point of having them do visual composition if we're not trying to connect it to their overall learning about rhetorical strategies and composition strategies, right? So when we're looking at their reflection, we need to be treating it like any other piece of writing where we're asking for particular prompts to be addressed and wanting to see those prompts addressed. Now, the stronger reflections you'll see will have not just a summary of what they did, but they'll have some personal application to how it applied to their work on the project. They might even give you a couple specific examples, and those would be really strong reflective writing, as confirmed by at least one empirical study. So that's reflection. That's reflection in general, reflection in the infographic. I'm going to pause for a second just to kind of catch my breath because I feel like I've been talking to you for a while. Everyone can take a break maybe, and I will come back and talk to you guys about grading the infographic itself. All right, back in action. So now I want to take on the question that you guys posed, which was, how do you grade the quality of students' infographics, especially considering that they may not have ever done an infographic before? That's totally a fair question, and I love the teacher's heart behind that question, because certainly we don't want to be evaluating our students unfairly on moves or strategies that we haven't yet taught them. So the maybe somewhat sassy answer to the question, how do you grade the quality of an infographic, is, well, it depends on the quality of your teaching. Damn, shots fired. No, I'm kidding. It really does, though, connect to what you've presented to them in class, right? So first of all, have you given them direct and explicit instruction on the rhetorical strategies needed to compose an effective visual? Have you given them appropriate, direct, explicit instruction on the conventions of this genre and how to identify and notice those conventions? Have you given them direct instruction on the design elements that will be appropriate to constructing an effective infographic? Have you given them formative feedback on their attempt at this genre? If you answered yes to all those questions, then I think you can reasonably evaluate the product that students create based on all of that direct instruction. You don't have to take my word for it, right? Shout out LeVar. So I'm going to draw here explicitly on Sarah Andrew Vaughn and Kathy Fleischer's work. They both wrote an article for NCTE, and they wrote a book about a project that they co-developed called the Unfamiliar Genre Project. So this is such a cool project. In it, Andrew Vaughn and Fleischer ask students to choose and research deliberately a challenging or completely unknown genre to the student. Does that sound familiar to anybody? That might be exactly what we're asking students to do in the infographic. We're just giving them a particular genre to focus on for ease and the sake of sustainability. But you know, they ask students to recognize the conventions, they ask students to learn about the genre, and then they ask students to create an original piece in that genre. Of course, students also have to kind of keep a reflection in action log. They also have to create a reflection and presentation piece that goes in their final portfolio. So one of the things that's interesting about this is that Andrew Vaughn and Fleischer argue that really we see the roots of this assignment supported by Bloom's taxonomy, of all things. But if we translate that over to what we do in 1020, it makes total sense, because Andrew Von and Fleischer argue that it is the application of the research and the learning that allows students that deeper retaining it in their memories. And we are trying to do that exact same thing, except we're adding an iteration to it. So not only are we assigning students an unfamiliar genre, at times, some students have made an infographic before, but we're having them investigate the conventions of this genre, then we're having them make the genre. So that's the one iteration of learning and then application. But we have another iteration that precedes it with the research paper. So students are thinking about how they've constructed their research argument in a large paper. And now they're thinking about the construction of their argument again in visual form. It gets way more concise. Students get way more focused on what is actually really important. And there's this double loop of Bloom's taxonomy, research, learning, and application. So it's not only possible to fairly and reasonably evaluate students' final infographics, especially if you are teaching, direct instructing them on the particulars that you're going to be evaluating them on, but also in doing so, you're helping students to actually have stake in the product such that they will be able to enforce their learning in another way. So, before I sign off on this video, I gave you a lot of spiels there, but I wanted to open up some of the resources and kind of talk you guys through how I try to instruct students directly and thus am able to fairly evaluate their final infographics. So hang on for just a second. I'm going to pull up that screen and then we'll just talk through that and we'll be all set. Okay, so here you guys can see the skeleton week by week suggested schedule for the infographic part of this project. What I've done is I've gone in and added in these highlighted days, because for me to effectively instruct the infographic, I need at least 4 days. I could maybe squeeze it into 3, but 4 would make it really comfortable and would allow me to cover all of the bases that I want to cover. So here's what teaching the infographic looks like for me. On day 1, I introduce the infographics as a genre, and I lead students through, I usually do this in groups. I have them do a group genre analysis activity. Now, for my students, we've talked about genre analysis at the beginning of the iSearch project, so bringing it up again isn't foreign or weird, like, here's this new kind of analysis. However, if you haven't talked about genre analysis at all, it's pretty simple to insert it here and call students back to their rhetorical analysis that they did at the beginning of the semester, and to point out the specific ways how genre analysis differs from rhetorical analysis and how you can actually build on those analytical skills that they had at the beginning to do genre analysis. So if anyone wants to, I can share my genre analysis activity that I have students go through. The main question for students in my class on day 1 of the infographic is, what is it? What even is an infographic? Of course, when they read it on the assignment, they're like, oh. And then when I show them the very first infographic, everyone universally is like, oh, yeah, those things. So at first, it will feel a little intimidating to students, but once you start showing them some examples and walking them through genre analysis, they get real comfortable real quick. So question on day 1, what is an infographic? What is this genre? What are the main conventions? How do they look? What makes an infographic an infographic? Then on day 2, part of their homework has been to go find samples of their own. And then they bring those in, we break into groups once again, and we do more genre analysis. But this time, our question is not just what is an infographic, but what makes a good infographic. So students are asked to add on a layer of analysis here that pushes them into some rhetorical analysis along with the genre analysis. So day 1, genre analysis. Day 2, genre analysis and rhetorical analysis in order to answer the question, what makes a good infographic? This is also often the day where I plan to do a brief mini lesson about design strategies. So I'll show you some of those right up here. I've got one that I've been using a lot lately is on the OWL at Purdue. There is a whole section on visual rhetoric with sections about text elements, the use of color, which is really interesting. They've got some good examples. They've got a whole section on the use of images. So I may assign students to read this. Also, another piece that I really like assigning to students on one of these first couple of days of the infographic project is the good and the evil of infographics. Once we know what an infographic is, then we can start having conversations about what makes not just a good infographic, but an ethical infographic. We talk about how images can be manipulated. We talk about what are more effective ways to show a message visually. So this is a really good piece to get students started on a discussion about characteristics of the infographic. There's a couple other readings too. This one, The Do's and Don'ts of Infographic Design, leads students through some specific design steps. But then also there's a lot of resources. The Schrock Guide, I believe her name is Kathy Schrock. She has created an entire website to support teachers who are teaching infographic assignments to their students. So there's a lot of things you could take from here. You could even just show this slide from one of her presentations where she's talking about ways to not just visualize data, but how to pull images in an ethical way, etc. So that's days 1 and 2. The next iteration is that students need to bring in their own drafts. I have them hand draw them on purpose because I want them to be able, first of all, to do something that's a little more low stakes, but also I want them to feel free to make big changes between their draft and their final. So this is the place where you would want to give students formative feedback. Not only are they getting feedback from their peers, but you could have conferences with students while they're doing peer review, just to lay eyeballs on their infographic and give them that key formative feedback to see if they're A, following the genre conventions, B, effectively using rhetorical visual strategies, and C, if they're using design elements appropriately. Those are the 3 key things that I'm looking for when I'm evaluating a student's infographic, because those are the 3 key things that I give them direct and explicit instruction on when we're working on them. Okay, so the last day is for presentations. The infographic should be due, and I always have students create a digital infographic. You can use Canva or Pictochart. Those are 2 free applications that students can use to create their infographics. But I mean, they're always welcome to like Adobe it up if that's more comfortable for them. But yeah, those are the 4 days of the infographic, and really the key to a fair and reasonable evaluation is direct and explicit instruction on the elements that you're going to be evaluating. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff. We talked about reflection, if we should even grade reflection at all. I gave you guys some of my arguments for, and particularly for the purposes for grading reflection. We talked about grading the reflection in the infographic and why that's a good idea, also how it can help students. And we talked about the infographic itself, how to evaluate. Why should we evaluate the infographics for these poor students who've never done it before? But I think we could see from Andrew Vaughn and Fleischer that that's not only possible, it's helpful to students and helps cement their learning. So hopefully sharing all this stuff with you is helpful as you move into teaching the infographic assignment to your students. Remember, direct, explicit instruction is the key to fair and reasonable evaluation. And if you have any questions about any of the stuff that I've just kind of like thrown at you digitally via this weird video, please feel free to shoot me an email or stop by my office anytime. I'd love to keep talking about this with you guys. All right. Thanks for having me. Bye, everybody.